The Bible establishes a clear rule. No Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even to the 10th generation. This is not commentary, it is law. The text does not explain, it does not soften, it leaves no room. And yet this rule remains within Scripture itself as the story continues. The question is not who the Moabites were. The question is why this exclusion exists, and why the text never takes the trouble to resolve it. Because when a divine law must be kept in silence, the problem is not outside the text, it is within it, and that is where the story begins. The prohibition against Moab does not appear as a marginal comment. It emerges as formal law, placed alongside other rules that organize the life of the people. The text suggests no exception, indicates no short term, points to no path of return. It simply records the exclusion and moves on. That alone would be enough to draw attention. But the unease grows when this rule is compared with others like it. Peoples who also harmed Israel, who also oppressed, who also acted with violence, are given milder limits. Some are set aside for only a few generations. Others, despite hostility, are not definitively closed off. Moab does not belong to that group. The law does not say that the exclusion is due to a specific military conflict. It does not mention a decisive war. It does not describe a particular act of idolatry that would explain such rigidity. The justification offered is brief, almost too sparse for the weight of the consequence it carries. And this creates an internal problem in the text, because Scripture does not usually treat neighboring peoples so definitively without constructing an extended explanation. Here, there is no development. There is a decree. The rule remains recorded while the narrative continues to move forward in time. Judges arise, kings rule, prophets speak, and still the exclusion of Moab remains there, intact, without additional comment, without revision, without a footnote. The attentive reader begins to realize that this is not an ordinary rule, not because of what it says, but because of the silence that accompanies it. A silence that does not resolve, does not contextualize, and does not soften. And when a law remains isolated within the text, without being re-explained, without being taken up again, it begins to generate an unsettling question. Not about Moab, but about the very operation of Scripture itself. Because absolute rules are usually sustained by equally absolute narratives. Here, that has not yet happened. And the chapter ends precisely at that point, with a law that is too firm, and a story that has not yet shown whether it will obey it to the end. The explanation offered by the text does not begin with war, nor with organized idolatry. It begins within Abraham's own family. Moab is born from Lot, not from a distant foreigner, not from a historic enemy, but from someone who walked alongside the patriarch, heard the same promises, and knew the same God by the same name. This alone shifts the usual reading, because Scripture normally draws a clear line between those who are inside and those who are outside. Here, that boundary blurs. Moab emerges from the same stock, the same early history, the same circle of covenants. There is no external rupture. There is an internal collapse. The text does not linger on the scene. It builds no suspense. It offers no moral commentary. It records the fact and moves on. Yet the effect remains. An entire people comes into existence carrying an origin that Scripture does not revisit, does not explain, and does not develop. And this is unusual. In other cases, the Bible tends to provide context. When there is a foundational transgression, the text usually returns to it, reinforces it, explains its consequences, and binds causes together. Here, it does not. The origin is mentioned once and then silenced. Even so, this origin begins to function as a key to everything that follows. Not because the text states this explicitly, but because the formal exclusion appears disproportionate when compared with other similar episodes. The reader begins to sense that this is not merely an isolated event, but something that remains active within the memory of the law. Moab is not set aside because of an act committed against Israel. It is set aside because of what it is from birth, not because of a later choice, but because of origin. And this strains another biblical principle, that each person answers for their own actions. The narrative does not resolve this tension, it simply allows it to grow. The origin is too close to be dismissed as distant paganism and too uncomfortable to be ignored as a mere genealogical detail. And so, the problem deepens, because now the exclusion no longer appears merely severe, it appears structural. And when an exclusion becomes structural, the text begins to demand something from the reader, not empathy, not judgment, but sustained attention, because the story is not yet finished, and what comes next will not make this reading any easier. The exclusion of Moab is not strange merely because it exists. It is strange because it does not follow the pattern of the biblical text itself. When the law imposes limits on other peoples, those limits are usually clear in cause and proportionate in duration. There is oppression, there is response. There is hostility, there is containment. In many cases, the separation is not definitive. It is pedagogical. With Moab, this does not happen. The Egyptians were direct oppressors. Even so, the law establishes a path of return. The Edomites maintained historic hostility. Even so, they are not closed off in the same way. Scripture is well acquainted with the language of temporary discipline. It understands correction as something that prepares the ground for reconciliation. Moab stands apart from this. The justification given does not mention open war or prolonged persecution. The text speaks of indirect actions, of refusals, of wrongful alliances, of offensive worship. But none of this seems proportionate to an exclusion that stretches across entire generations. The consequence outweighs the description of the offense, and this begins to create an internal imbalance in the text. The rule applied to Moab is harsher than that applied to peoples who committed more visible acts of violence against Israel. Traditional readings often resolve this quickly by appealing to lists of sins. But the text does not organize those sins as a direct cause of the exclusion. It simply decrees. That distinction matters, because when Scripture intends to justify severe judgment, it is usually careful. It repeats, reinforces, and recalls. Here, the exclusion remains recorded, without the narrative repeatedly returning to defend it. And when a severe rule is not reiterated, something is happening. Either it is so obvious that it requires no explanation, or it is so uncomfortable that the text does not press it. The attentive reader begins to notice that Moab occupies an unusual position. It is not treated as a classic enemy. It is not treated as a distant nation. It is not treated as a simple pagan people. It is something in between, too close to be ignored, too distant to be integrated. This intermediate position is dangerous because it escapes easy categories. And everything that escapes those categories begins to strain a straightforward reading of the law. The exclusion of Moab is not merely more rigid, it is poorly fitted within the overall system, like a piece that belongs to the set but does not align perfectly. And when a piece does not align, the text begins to ask something of the reader, not immediate judgment, but a willingness to move forward without resolving everything at once. Because the story has not yet shown what it will do with this rule. And the silence continues to weigh. The exclusion of Moab is reinforced by an expression that seems simple, but is not. To the 10th generation. At first glance, it sounds like a clear, almost mathematical limit. But within biblical thought, this kind of language rarely functions as a literal count. It points to extended duration, prolonged memory, a consequence that reaches beyond the individual. Scripture uses this kind of expression to describe something that remains active for a long time. Not infinite, but long enough to shape identity. The 10th generation is not merely a number. It is a way of saying that the mark does not fade quickly, that it follows a people through complete cycles, and this makes the rule even heavier. Because now it is no longer a matter of immediate exclusion. It is a matter of inheritance. Something transmitted. Something that passes from parents to children without the text indicating a clear point of closure. The problem is that Scripture itself, elsewhere, insists that guilt is not to be transferred automatically between generations. Each person answers for their own actions. Each generation is called to choose. This principle appears repeatedly, including in legal texts. Here, it seems suspended. Moab continues to carry an exclusion that does not depend on individual choice. The behavior of a specific Moabite does not matter. The barrier remains. And the text does not explain how this is sustained without violating the very principle that the law affirms in other contexts. This mismatch is subtle, but real. A rule that operates by inheritance. A system that normally insists on personal responsibility. The two coexist without explanation. The reader begins to realize that the problem is not merely historical. It is conceptual. How does a law based on generations remain within a text that affirms that each generation answers for itself? The Bible does not pause to respond. It offers no reconciling commentary. It does not say how these two ideas coexist. It simply maintains both. And this creates a silent pressure. Because now, the exclusion of Moab is not only severe or disproportionate, it appears unstable, not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of requiring something more in order to hold. When the text begins to accumulate this kind of tension, it is preparing the ground for something, not necessarily for revocation, but for a narrative movement the reader has not yet seen. And at this point, the question is no longer whether the exclusion will end. The question is how Scripture itself will deal with the weight it has placed there. After the rule is established, the text does not return to it insistently. The exclusion remains recorded, but the biblical narrative begins to move forward in time without reaffirming it at every step. Judges arise. Crises repeat themselves. The life of the people continues, and the law remains there, silent, like a fixed boundary that no one seems willing to debate. This movement is unusual. When a rule is central, Scripture normally brings it back. It recalls it, applies it, uses it as a reference point. Here, it does not. The exclusion of Moab is not erased, but neither is it constantly invoked. It hangs suspended, as though the text trusts that the reader still remembers it. And it is precisely in this silent advance that something begins to happen. The narrative starts to deal with scarcity, displacement, survival. Families move. Land fails to sustain them. People cross borders not because of political strategy, but because of basic necessity. And within this flow, the rigidity of the rule is not discussed. It is simply not mentioned. This does not mean it has been forgotten. It means the text chooses not to place it at the center at that moment. And that choice matters. Because when a law is not called upon to arbitrate every movement, it begins to be tested not by direct confrontation, but by silent coexistence. The attentive reader senses that the story is approaching a delicate point. Not because anyone openly challenges the law, but because real life begins to produce situations that the law on its own does not resolve easily. There is no announcement. There is no debate. There is no prophet explaining what is about to happen. The narrative simply continues. And in continuing, it draws together people, territories, and decisions that place the rule in an uncomfortable position. Not because it is false, but because it must now coexist with human choices that the text refuses to interrupt. This is a recurring pattern in Scripture. When something is not resolved by decree, the text allows history to advance until the tension becomes too evident to ignore. Not with noise, with proximity. The exclusion of Moab has not yet been broken. Nothing has been revoked. No exception has been announced. But for the first time, the rule ceases to be merely a written statement and begins to exist within a moving story. And when that happens, the reader should already know the text is not moving towards a quick explanation. It is moving towards a point where the narrative itself will have to carry the weight of what was decreed long ago. The story does not announce a rupture. It declares no change in the law. It calls no assembly. It simply follows a decision too small to draw attention. Made far from priests, outside religious debate, distant from any discourse about exclusion or belonging. Nothing there appears to challenge the law. Nothing sounds revolutionary, and yet the rule remains, written, valid, not revoked. That is what makes the situation untenable, because now the narrative moves forward without asking permission from the boundary imposed earlier. There is no explanation, no defense. The text simply records the movement and continues, as though history has chosen to proceed even when the law no longer explains everything that is happening. This is the most uncomfortable point of all. Not when the exclusion is decreed, but when it must coexist with a reality that no longer fits within it. Scripture does not resolve this tension. It keeps it open, suspended, unsettling. And when the Bible does this, it is not carelessness. It is a silent warning. Because from this point on, it is no longer the law that carries the story. It is the story that begins to carry the law. And not every boundary survives intact when that happens.